I'm going to be talking to you about actually trying to understand trees, and also because we can't actually understand trees without also understanding the fungi, which make their home in the neighborhood of trees and within the bodies of trees. So actually we can't understand trees without understanding fungi. To some extent, I'm also going to be asking us to try to understand ourselves, because a lot of the environmental problems that we encounter these days are down to human psychology and the way we have led ourselves to think about ourselves and the natural world. And I've no doubt at all, really, that for several thousand years we've been teaching us to think, ourselves to think, in a way which is psychologically, environmentally, and socially damaging. We need to be able to think in a different kind of way, and actually, to my mind, in a more realistic way than we have been thinking for thousands of years. And the trees and the fungi and all life forms really help us to understand that. I sort of came up with a thought just yesterday when someone was talking about how we neglect the diversity of life and so on. And I said, well, we need not to ask what biology has to tell us about the diversity of life, but we need to understand what the diversity of life has to tell us about biology and about ourselves as human beings as inclusions, natural inclusions of the world about us. So there we are. We're going to talk about understanding trees and fungi as flow forms, and I've warned you that there's going to be a bit of philosophy and a bit of psychology involved as well. And the story I'm going to tell you is one of mutually inclusive relationship. Okay? Thinking about ourselves and one another as inclusions of one another's identity, not exclusions, not narcissistic exclusions of one another's identity. So let's have a first slide, shall we? So we could ask a question of identity to begin with. Do you ever ask yourself these questions? I do. It's kind of embarrassing. What is a tree? What is a fungus? How do trees and fungi relate? Suddenly asking a question of relationship. How do our answers to the third question relate to our answers to the first two questions? And how does this relate, or this influence how we ourselves relate to trees and fungi? Can we have a next one? So what is a tree? Is it a stick in the mud? Is it a utility? Is it an obstacle or threat? These are utilitarian views of trees, or objectifying views of trees, where we're seeing trees as objects isolated from ourselves, independent of ourselves, stuck in the landscape. But what I shall invite you to consider is to understand a tree as an expression of natural energy flow. Okay, here it is behind me. Look, it's expressing itself. It's an expression of natural energy flow. Next one. Here's an imaginative insight, which actually contrasts the objectifying view of trees with the understanding of trees as an expression of natural energy flow. Even, I shall dare to say, as a scientist, an expression of love. Okay, so let me go back to that. We've got the interesting effect of having lost what's on the screen. There we are. That was exciting for a moment. So here's William Blake and what William Blake had to say. The tree which moves some to tears of joy is in the eyes of others only a green thing which stands in the way. Some see nature as all ridicule and deformity,
and some scarce see nature at all. But by the eyes of a man, and if it was a man and a bloke in those days, we should have said a woman, of course, as well, as a man or a woman of imagination, nature is imagination itself, an expression of natural energy flow. Next one. And here's what a picture I rather like of an encounter between the natural flow geometry of a tree and the abstract geometry of human beings. We see what the tree really thinks of straight lines and rigid definitive barriers. And we see it nicely finding the gaps between them in a beautiful, fluid, flowing way. So I think you know the trees all flow form already. What is a fungus? Is it a lollipop on a web? Well, of course, one of the things about fungi that we all need to understand is when we see mushrooms and toadstools and things like that appearing out in the open, that these are only the film stars whose purpose is to advertise and reproduce. But behind the scenes is this wonderful creature called the mycelium, the production team, which is a mass of branching tip-extending tubes that collectively gather together the nutrients and moisture that the fungus needs in order to express itself as a mushroom or toadstool. So is a fungus a lollipop on a web? This is Coprinus picaceus, or it's Coprinopsis picaceus these days, I think, magpie ink cap, and below it is a picture of the mycelium, this production team of the fungus grown in a matrix of alternating high and low nutrient domains, and showing how it produces this wonderful network, this wonderful communications network. And I shall return to that later. So is a fungus a lollipop on a web, an ally, an enemy, or an expression of natural energy flow? Next one. This is mycophobia. This is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A sickly autumn shone upon the land, wet and rotten leaves reeked and festered under the foul haze. The fields were spotted with monstrous fungi, of a size and colour never matched before, scarlet and mauve and liver and black. It was as though the sick earth had burst into foul pustules. Mildew and lichen mottled the walls, and with that filthy crop, death sprang from the water-soaked earth. So there's a way there's a psychological view of fungi as represented in minds of a number of people still. Okay, well now I'm going to go into a philosophical aside. And I'm going to go into something to do with philosophy and something to do with human psychology and how we understand our own self-identity and how we understand the identity of others. I want you, first of all, I'm asking you now, yourself, to imagine yourself with no natural internal space. Imagine your body devoided of space, utterly devoided of space. Where would you be? Stunning thought, eh? Yes? You might be nowhere. Or you might, well, you wouldn't be anywhere distinguishable, would you? Imagine natural space without material form. What would it be like? Well, there's a quite obvious answer to that. It would be formless. So we have these two sort of aspects of the natural world, of a material bodily form, and we have natural space. And I have to say natural space to distinguish it from mathematical space, which is quite different. And there's an inference here. Natural space and bodily form are mutually inclusive, not mutually exclusive, as is assumed by abstract definitive logic. Matter cannot be dissociated from space and continue to exist. Your self-identity naturally includes your neighborhood. I am naturally included in my neighborhood and an expression of my neighborhood. I cannot live without my neighborhood. My neighborhood is, and I am an expression of my neighborhood. Very simple way of thinking that contrasts with a narcissistic way of thinking which isolates the self from its neighborhood. And it's all down to thinking very simply about natural space and natural material bodily form. So we have a sense of self-identity now as a natural inclusion of neighborhood. Yeah? Next slide. Yep. Well, let's imagine yourself as a dimensionless point in space. That's what you'd be if you'd removed all the space from your body. Yeah, you'd be a dimensionless point in space. How could you be some body? Well, you wouldn't be able to do it by standing still. Yeah, because you'd be an isolated point in space. You'd only be able to do it by circulating around. Yeah, a point of space, a bit like electrons circulating around the nucleus of an atom. Or if you think about a whirlpool, where a whirlpool, the form of a whirlpool is an expression of circulation, yeah, around a central stillness. Okay, that's what we are. Circulations around central stillnesses. We have, or circulations around a receptive center, responsive circulations. Anyway, so where we end up with that is understanding that all natural forms are intrinsically dynamic. They're not pushed and pulled around by external force. We are intrinsically dynamic. We are made of motion and stillness. Including you, including trees, including fungi. Yep.
I just want to check with everybody, have a little show of hands. How are you feeling about that? Do you feel like you followed that? Yeah? Okay, great, well done.
Not many people do. Next one, please. And the third is really the title of my latest book, which I have a copy with me, is The Origin of Life Patterns in the Natural Inclusion of Space in Flux. And it's actually a psychology textbook, which is kind of interesting that it's using my understanding of biology and the natural world to make commentary about cultural and social psychology. But we're beginning to understand that natural geometry, not the geometry we've been taught, in school, is flow geometry, a dynamic expression of responsive energetic movement within around the receptive stillness of intangible omnipresent space. We're looking at a receptive responsive relationship in the emergence of natural bodily flow form. Space welcomes. Space is ignored in most thinking. Space welcomes energy flows into myriad manifestations, variations on a theme of primarily curved place-time, not space-time. A locality, a dynamic locality in space. Life begins in round one as a dynamic inclusion of space. It does not start as square one, as a frozen solid box. So all that geometry that we've been taught in school, starting with the three-dimensional box, is an abstraction in terms of really understanding how natural form comes into being and becoming. Next one. Well, that was a bit grand, but there we go. Now let's come back a little bit to talking about the fountains of the forest as manifestations of diverse dynamic relationship. This is a painting I made when following my year as president of the British Mycological Society, following which I withdrew from mycology. But that's another long story. But essentially, it's a painting in which I represented my understandings of the relationships between the trees in a forest and the fungi. Yep. And we'll start exploring that a little bit more closely. Next one. Let's start with a question of health and disease. You know, when we're talking about fungi and we're talking about trees, most people sort of, oh, friends and foes of the trees, you know, all those sorts of ideas. And of course, one of the issues about planting lots of trees is about susceptibility to disease. Yep. And are we planting the right trees in the right place? And how are we caring for them? Are we actually thinking about the circumstances in which they're growing and the relationships that they're involved in as part of their natural growth? So how do trees and fungi relate to one another? Well, there are two kinds of ways, following on from what I've been saying, in which people have been inclined to think about this. The very, very common way, which you'll see all the time shown on television and everywhere else, is that they are thought of as independent competitors and collaborators struggling for an existence. That is the Darwinian view. Of course, Darwin didn't invent it, but that's another story. But it is that sort of Darwinian view of the struggle for existence and how we have come through abstract logic, through abstract thought, to think of or to project our own psychology onto the natural world. The second way is to think of this question in terms of as needful flow forms, and this is what I call the natural inclusional view. Following my departure from mycology, I became interested in the way we think and the issues concerning the way we think and feel about the natural world, and that led me to an awareness of what I now call natural inclusion, as distinct from natural selection, which isn't natural at all. But that's another long story. Next question. Next slide even. So let's have a look at the usual way that we examine these things. Yeah, keep nearly knocking the tree over behind me, which is unfortunate. Okay, well, a very, very common way of, move the chair back, yes. Good, I can walk around now. That's more exciting. Okay, so a very, very common way of doing this is in terms of this kind of categorical cost-benefit analysis. You'll find this in all the ecological textbooks. We're looking at a relationship between two forms, and we're deciding whether one is benefiting or the other is benefiting, or neither is benefited. Yeah. And we sort of have it, code it in this plus, minus, naught, plus, and so on. A whole string of terms to describe different kinds of relationships that we might get associated between a pair of organisms. Very, very common representation. Next slide. There are problems with that. Just think about it. How do you actually evaluate cost and benefit impartially? Now, impartially doesn't mean objectively, it means comprehensively. That's another big issue. Think about it. Impartially means not partially. Okay, how do you actually evaluate cost and benefit? When we look at these things in terms of two organisms, you've left out all the other ones that that are living in their neighborhood. So we've missed out third parties. This actually relates to a philosophical problem which Newton solved by doing things just two at a time, which is called the three-body problem. The whole approach is restricted to a fixed reference frame. We're sort of imagining this in a fixed context when life is continually changing. And it's purely transactional. It's neglecting the context, the neighborhood, in which all this is going on. Next one. And this is contrast with a natural inclusional approach, which I favor, which is thinking in terms of flow and counterflow, impartial evaluation of energy flows, contextual, inclusive of ecological neighborhood, dynamic, accounting for changing circumstances, evolutionarily open. We're examining things in an open-minded way, a receptive, responsive way, thinking about the dynamic of the situation. We're not looking at a tree in a snapshot in space and time as a stick in the mud. We're understanding that it came from somewhere and it's going somewhere and relating with all these other organisms in the process. Next. So again, we start to think about origins of health and disease. Wonderful phrase which I came across, the father of germ theory, on his deathbed. The microbe is nothing. The terrain is all. Wow. This was the father of germ theory. A recognition of the absolutely fundamental importance of context. So there are two sort of ways of thinking about agency in this relation. Abstract agency or self-imposition, sort of when you're thinking of yourself as an isolated narcissistic self with exerting your power over others. You'll think in terms of the quest for dominion and the struggle for life. You'll think about local action and reaction. You'll think about linear cause and effect, and you'll talk about survival of the fittest. But if you're thinking about natural agency, you're changing that model to a model of self-sustainability. So we're thinking about home seeking and making. We're thinking about receptive, responsive, reciprocating. We're thinking not about the survival of the fittest, but the sustainability of the fitting. Next one. And this links again to abstract and natural perceptions of health and disease. Abstract perception, all about productivity, all about, is this healthy, fit, unproductive? Yes, I mean, productive means healthy and fit. Unproductive means diseased or unfit. So an unpredictive organism, is diseased or unfit. Interesting. Unproductivity associated with inability, disability, and not being. But a natural view is actually thinking about whether or not an organism is attuned to its context. And if it's attuned, fitting in, so to speak, it's healthy or fitting, and if it's discordant, then in some senses it's diseased or misfitting. And I say all this because it's really quite controversial in some ways, but it's about asking you to think rather carefully, because those two different perceptions profoundly affect our management attitudes and practice, what we're actually going to do. Yeah, when we're talking about planting trees or nurturing trees or whatever it may be. Yeah, it's going to affect that, how we actually view this situation. Next. So let's talk about trees. You might not have thought of them as this way. Trees as welcome homes for fungi, where we're thinking about trees and trees as embodied water, flows from roots to branch and back. Here's what I said about my painting of Fountains of the Forest in 1998. A tree is a solar-powered fountain. Its spray supplied through wood-lined conduits and sealed in by bark until their final outburst in leaves. Within and upon its branching, enfolding, water-containing surfaces, and reaching out from there into air and soil, are branching, enfolding, water-containing surfaces of finer scale, the mycelial networks of fungi, which provide a communications interface for energy transfer from neighbor to neighbor, from living to dead, and from dead to living. As you will understand in a few moments, I'm rather delighted David Reed is here with us today, because he inspired quite a lot of that thought himself. So next, well, let's start thinking about a tree as a home for a fungus. Okay, so imagine yourself, thinking about what it's like in your home. Yeah, what makes your life comfortable and what doesn't make it comfortable. Just a few things to be a little bit aware of when we're thinking about the nature of a tree, the fundamental nature of a tree, and how we can think of it as a welcome home or not so welcome home for fungi. First, we need to understand that growth and metabolic activity in fungi depends on aeration. Okay, we have to have oxygen to serve respiratory needs and growth needs. Oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse much faster, in fact 10,000 times faster, in gas than in liquid. So if your wood is full of water, it's going to be pretty difficult for a fungus to grow fast. That follows from there that the distribution of moisture and aeration channels in trees varies and both influences and is influenced by the distribution and activity of fungi. Okay? So imagine you know your house. You've got some inhabitants. Well, what the inhabitants are doing is going to affect the environment within the house. And what this all sets the scene for a complex, dynamic relationship sensitive to changeable environmental circumstances. When we're talking about climate change, for example, when looking at how the context is changing in which trees are growing, well, this is going to affect the relationships that are going to go on within the tree with its inhabitant fungi. Next, and that's complex. So we could ask, what influences moisture and aeration distribution in trees? Well, obviously the wood and bark anatomy, the system of pipelines, and some nice high water repellent coating around those. Seasonality, so that the water columns will be under tension at some times of year, under pressure at other times of year. The activity of the inhabitant organisms. Loss of conductive function because tree pipelines don't continue to conduct indefinitely. They get cavitated, they get air filled, like we get gas in pipes, air bubbles in pipes, it sort of interrupts the flow. And as we have an increase in girth and heartwood formation, we're going to produce some interesting compounds associated with secondary metabolism, which may or may not be toxic to fungi. We've got a question of relationship between supply and demand, the root to shoot ratio. We're looking at the effects of death and removal of bark and living tissue due to damage and stress. Huge amounts of damage is done in forestry. And all of that is exposing the tree, the tree's vital plumbing system, to dysfunction. Physiological stress, especially drought. Huge amount of tree death associated with drought very often, of course, and that's an issue in relation to climate change. And as I sort of half mentioned, the question of hydrophilic, water absorbing and water repellent compounds. All makes it, when you think about these things, it's quite a complex issue. Next. Fungal home life. Fungi are most active where aeration and moisture supply are adequate but not excessive. Neither too wet nor too dry, but just right. And also where inhibitory chemical compounds are minimal. We also need to recognize, and this was something that wasn't really recognized, and perhaps I played a little bit of a role in recognizing it, that fungi can be present in latent or dormant form even when active growth is restricted. So you can be present when you're not getting much air, but you're not doing much. But suddenly if you're already present and the pipes get air filled, woo! You can explode into life, and many fungi do. They're known as endophytes. Fungi can themselves enhance the receptivity for their accommodation in tree space. What I mean, when you can make things more, you can make yourself at home. Yes, you make things more comfortable for yourself. You make the living conditions a little bit better. And it's quite interesting to recognize that not only are we talking about relationships between trees and fungi, but we're talking about how the fungi get on with one another too, how they relate to one another. And those encounters between fungi can be many and varied. Next. So let's home in and around roots. So this is David's special contribution domain, thinking about parasitic, mycorrhizal, and rhizosphere fungi, and encountering the rotters, communicators, and friends of the earth, the fungi. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. And here's one I borrowed a long, long time ago from David, showing the idea of he introduced 2 tree seedlings into a chamber of soil and showed how mycorrhizal fungi, the mycelium, this production team of the mycorrhizal fungi, can interconnect the different seedlings. So even though we might look as we've got lots of separate sticks in the ground above the soil, they're interconnected by fungal mycelium underneath the soil, not as isolated from one another as they might at first seem, but joined together in holy matrimony by fungi. There we are. So we can have possibilities for fellowship and parental care, mediated through mycelial channels. Next. And then, of course, in the heartwood. The heartwood is this area that has lost its function. It's gas-filled, but usually filled more with carbon dioxide than with oxygen. It has other difficult compounds in it. You've generated usually phenolic and terpenoid compounds, which are inhibitory to fungi. And this means only certain fungi can manage to find a home in heartwood. But by golly, once they've found their home, what a huge volume of wood they've got for their production team. And so they can manifest themselves as huge outgrowths. Yeah, huge fruiting outgrowths on the outside of the tree. But they're inhabiting the heartwood. They hollow out the interior of the tree so that many a mature tree is a hollow tree. And it's still very strong. Because, of course, a hollow cylinder, in mechanical terms, strength of weight for weight is more strong than a solid rod. And that's quite interesting because many of our most veteran trees in this country, which are so important in our landscape, are hollow. And they're hollow because of the activity of fungi. Next. Out on a limb, well, this was a study we once did of looking at the fungi that colonize attached oak branches and realizing why it is that old, dead, attached oak branches have this wonderful sculptured form. And it's all to do with the interfacing between the fungal activity and dysfunction within the sapwood of the branch. Take me too long to explain it, but when you go out and see these lovely ridges and grooves that you'll see on old attached oak branches, that wonderful sculpturing, think about the relationships that underlie it between the functioning and dysfunctioning sapwood and the inhabiting fungi. Next. And then, of course, encounters in the fallen world. Once our tree has fallen to the ground or dropped a log or two or been felled or whatever, then the possibility arises for many different fungi, both of the same and of different species, to colonize the wood and form territories. Because actually fungal mycelia are very, very territorial. I don't say they're warlike because I think there's a radical difference between natural territoriality and idealistic warfare, which we need to understand. But over here on the left here, we see this wonderful spalted beech log in which over here we've got about 70 individuals, Asterium hirsutum, another 20 Meldonobulvis pyrrhus. On either side of that territorial boundary line there, we've got 2 individuals, which are Candarodusta. Over here, we've got Coriolis versicolor, or invading into domain previously held by Udimantula mucida, and so on. When we look at that, we can look at that and we can recognize, this is exciting. This dead log is full of life, doing all sorts of exciting things. And here are some fungi grown in culture, just illustrating the things that can happen when different fungi meet. And they can invade one another, they can reject one another, or they can mate. That's an interesting story in itself. Yeah, fungi are very sexy. Next. And actually, here's a lovely picture, or series of pictures, illustrating a wonderful phenomenon that occurs in the mycelium of fungi, called hypofussion, whereby what is initially a radiating branching system, the branches can meet one another and fuse to transform a radial communication system into a network, a true labyrinth, a true communication system. Yeah, not a spider's web, but a labyrinth of internal space. Okay, and we see here where this hypha coming down here got onto the side of that one. Then it's opened the way here for continuity between the two. So that and this is actually really important to the ability of fungi to mushroom, is that you've got to change that in series system, into an in parallel system in order to generate the energy to manifest a fruit body. Next. And here's fungal foraging. Imagine yourself to be a fungus, as I often used to, living in the soil, and your food is in different locations. Okay, so you've got to get across a desert, in order to find your food. So we did this experiment where we introduced a fungus called sulfur tough fungus, very familiar, on a wood block into a tray full of soil, gave it an uncolonized wood block over here to find, and it grew out, and it found the wood block, and then it consolidated those lines of communication and allowed the rest of the initial exploration to die back. Death included in the life of the organism finding its way through between different bits of a nutrient resource in a desert. Next. And so here I am, uncovering fungal hidden networks. I brought one in the car, actually. I almost brought it in, but I thought, But if you want to see a fungal network, I've got some lovely networked logs in the back of my car, which we might have a look at lunchtime. But here I am with an illegal penknife at the time. Probably best not to know that, but anyway, showing people the mycelial cord system of Megacalypia platyphylla, which can so easily be exposed just by scraping away the litter around the fruit body. Next. And here's the matrix of showing how fungi can do this. This is the magpie inkcap mycelium grown in this alternating array of nutrient-rich and nutrient-depleted pore zones, allowing to grow from one to the other. And I won't go into great depth, but look at that extraordinary behavior, the way the fungus, this production team, can manage to produce this glorious communications network in a way that our traffic flow engineers seem not to have quite worked out how to do yet. But fungi have lessons for us in this regard. Next. And I leave you with this thought. In sustainable natural communities, life is a gift of energy to be received, sustained, and passed on in natural relay, not a struggle for existence. Thank you.
Yeah. That was brilliant. It was brilliant, and it was fabulous to have the opportunity, obviously early in the morning when we've had a coffee and can still concentrate, to join you on that journey. I'm so glad that you took the time to go through the philosophical aspects so that we could kind of shift our brains to the point that when you then brought in the stuff around the fungal networks, we were able to see the ramifications of that. I think you did that really nicely. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask Dr. Alan Rayner a question? If so, you may raise your hands now. Oh, yes, there is. There's a microphone here with a lady with a yellow scarf. If you could come right in, please. Would you mind introducing yourself and then speaking clearly into the mic?
Hi, yeah,
Thank
John Tucker from the Woodland Trust.
Hello.
Great talk, Alan. You touched on, well, are there things that we should be doing in practice, when we're planting trees, growing trees, looking after trees, that you think we're not at the moment based on what you've been saying this morning?
That's quite a hard question to answer. I think what I really want to just invite you to do is to think about that question as you just have for yourself, and thinking now, is what I'm doing here really taking full account, of this complex system that I'm working with? I mean, there are obviously things that people managing forests might do without thought, and for example, causing huge amounts of damage during timber extraction and that kind of situation. It's largely all about increasing our awareness of the sensitivity of what we're working with. And I'm sure a lot of people will feel that, but we perhaps haven't quite, because we're used to being pretty brutal managers as human beings, because we've got this way of thinking, which is all about power over and not power with. Yeah. And so really, if you're actually thinking differently in terms of the living system that you're intervening in, and having a sense of working with it, not against it, yeah, that's and not sort of necessarily putting all your focus, all your attention on enhanced productivity, and notwithstanding what David has said, which is valid, but we also have to think about balancing what David has said about, it's okay, this is what's most productive, this is the best vacuum cleaner, but there are other issues too, which are very important for our human well-being, and we need to come to a sort of, and for the well-being of the forests and of the inhabitants of the forests. Yeah, so we have to think about all those things too. Monocultures, yeah, maybe great vacuum cleaners, but what about everything else? Okay.
Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question? Oh yeah. Okay. Could you come round, please? Or Keita, she's going to come to you.
My name's Liz Cruz. I'm a member of Glastonbury Friends of the Earth. What you've said, Alan, has ramifications obviously way outside of forestry. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas for how these ideas of networking and working in harmony can be got out beyond these kind of environments.
That's a heck of a question, and one which I've been struggling with for the last 17, 18 years since I really started to try to introduce an awareness of natural inclusion. The sort of level of hostility and resistance that I've encountered to some of the things that I've just said to you has been quite extraordinary to me. And it is to do with this, it's to do with language, and actually recognizing that there are limitations in the familiar language that we use, which reinforce particular ways of thinking. In particular, what I mean is definitive thinking. As soon as you say to me, "Can you define a fungus, Alan?" I will say no. Okay? Because that sort of the very idea of definitive thinking is one of the major blocks, but it's what we've been taught to do. Categorical thinking, definitive thinking, it's there throughout our school curriculum. The ability to think in a different way is not. And there's a massive problem in the way we educate ourselves and our offspring, teaching them to continue to think in the way that I consider to be environmentally, socially, and psychologically damaging. So how you open it up? I mean, first of all, there's someone like me who can just try and open it up for myself, but it does radically depend on other people understanding why I'm saying what I'm saying, and not just trying to pick holes in it intellectually, which you can't actually do because no one has succeeded that I've encountered yet, though they've tried very, very hard. And I'm quite an anxious person too, so I'm very, very sensitive to the possibility of being wrong and accepting of that possibility. But I haven't come across anybody yet who has, with good reason, questioned what I've suggested. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of understanding the way we are in the natural world as human beings within a natural neighborhood. And so much of what we learn, there are problems in the foundations of mathematics. Sorry, but there are. that lead us to think in this definitive way, this either-or way. Historically, it goes all the way back, at least to Aristotle, and the law of the excluded middle, which holds that one thing cannot simultaneously be another thing, which essentially is the law of isolating one from another. Yeah? And so on and so on. And until a larger body of people start to become aware of that, then we've got big problems. And that's really, one of the reasons why, within the context of this conference, I said at the outset, I'm not just thinking about relationships between and understanding trees and fungi. I'm talking about human psychology, because that's the biggest block of all. And it's deeply embedded in the way we've been teaching ourselves and what makes us feel secure. It's to do with our attitudes to death, all sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, I have written lots about it. So it's available. That's all I can have done. It's available everywhere if you care to look for it.
And if you did look on the table at the back, that would be a really specific example of where you could flick through some of Alan's work, provided by Speaking Tree Books with Gareth. And there are examples of other writing there as well. The most recent one is published by an academic publishers, so that's harder to get hold of. There's some of the some of the ones before that are purchasable online at a not so expensive price.
My latest book's very expensive indeed.
So I'd like to thank you again so enormously for the depth of your perception that you've brought and the opportunity that you've given us around our scientific language to be able to explore the relationships that we'll explore throughout the rest of the day, including as we move on to the Tree Sisters and Wendy, that nation of receptive awareness of nature. Thank you very much.
Letting go, heaven now mounting from a place to ever soar.